Good afternoon. I'm Mae Ferguson, President and CEO of Fort Worth Sister Cities International. So glad to have you this afternoon. We are partnering with the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce today to present you a very interesting program all about China. You'll hear from Chris Strayer at the end of the presentation, and he will be conducting a question and answer session with Dr. Currier. So please save your questions or put them in the chat box, and we will get to those at the end of the program. Fort Worth Sister City International's mission is to promote Fort Worth and to enrich the local community through international education, exchange, and commerce. We wanted to focus this presentation on China because Fort Worth has a Chinese sister city, Guiyang, China, which we selected in 2011. Guiyang has a population of almost 5 million people, I believe, at this time, and is the capital of the Guizhou province, which is a political, cultural, and economic center in China. We invited Dr. Currier to speak on this subject because she's a dear friend of ours, having helped us do all of the research along with the Chamber of Commerce and the city's Economic Development Department to select our Chinese sister cities. She was very valuable during that process, and we're delighted to have her speak with us today. Dr. Carrie Currier is Associate Professor and Chair of the Political Science Department at TCU. She teaches courses in Asian politics, comparative politics, feminist international relations theory, international relations, and global political economy. Her research is generally focused on economic reform in China, China's foreign policy with the Middle East, China's energy policy, China's one-child policy, and the politics of entrepreneurship in Taiwan and China. Friends of ours have helped us now for 10, she's been helping us for 10 years on our relations with China. But personally, I've known Carrie for a long time, and she's an avid tennis player. She plays competitive tennis almost every day. And one great fact I learned about her today, she is ranked top 10 in the world in her age group for women's doubles, and has been playing in Europe and international tournaments recently. So it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Carrie Currier.
Thank you, Mae. I'm going to go ahead and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And thank you to both Sister Cities and the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce for having me here today. So can everybody, I guess I can't see if anybody else can see my screen, but, and I can't see anybody else from my Zoom. So can people see my screen? I'm uncertain. Somebody would have to, okay, good. Just making sure. So today's talk is Return of the Dragon, China's Challenges and Opportunities Post-COVID. And what I wanted to do is really, quite honestly, it's virtually impossible for me to cover all of this today, but I wanted to give you an overview of the topics that I think will get us to the right place. So give us a sense of the context for where we are now, give you some insight into the Chinese and how they're weathering the COVID challenges and that recovery, as well as give us a chance to think about how it impacts Sino-US relations moving forward. So what I'm really giving you is a chance to try to bring together these different pieces that you really hear about in the news, and then weave it into a single story today on China, with the hopes that it gives you a better understanding of China and allows us to think a little bit more about a less contentious future for Sino-US relations. So we know that decoupling is not possible. Full-scale cooperation is a little bit unlikely. The wolf warrior diplomacy and the tensions of the past few years are really not sustainable. So how do we get to an amicable state of what we might consider to be cooperative competition? And so you can see from this overview, what I wanted to talk about is a sense of the Sino-US economic relationship pre-COVID, the current era and challenges to the relationship, a sense of China's strategy and rebounding forward out of COVID, as well as understanding what the future looks like. So China's challenges and opportunities and what this relationship looks like moving forward. So that's the overview for today. So let's start with a brief overview of pre-COVID Sino-US relations and economic relations in particular. And since most of us probably already know this story, I just wanted to add a few pieces that are important to get us to that end game, to understand where we go moving forward. So we know that Trump's views and policies towards China already, we have a sense of those. So it's really unnecessary to recap the past 4 years in their entirety. But we do have to remind ourselves that presidential candidates, Republicans and Democrats alike, have generally been tough on China in the run up to an election. Nobody wants to be soft on China. So we've seen that in the past. We saw it, of course, in the lead up for Trump's election, and of course into the current election as well. Nobody's soft on China. So the hardline stance that Trump took before is not as unique as one might think. The difference is that when this was followed by some really hard-hitting changes like the trade war that was directed more at China and designed to hit China in its pocketbook and poke at the Chinese economy, that's what sort of changed the relationship. So I want to point out that the economy is really one of those delicate spots that, while I don't have the time right now in just 30 minutes to go through the full background and the extent of this issue, I do want to hit home one key point. And that is one thing that many people don't necessarily think about or consider, is that the economy and its well-being is essential to the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping's sense of legitimacy, because it's really how they maintain their position in power today. So it's that source of legitimacy, because if you think about the Communist Party today and how the Xi Jinping and the party stays in power, it's not on the basis of these fundamentals of communist ideals. So if the economy stops performing, this is potentially destabilizing in several ways. So to cut to the chase, when we think of the basics to which the party maintains its power, again, it's not on the basis of the fundamentals of communist ideals, it's on economic performance. Now, the Chinese call their economic model socialism with Chinese characteristics. And while we can clearly see that in reality, this model is at its core a capitalist model, that's just a longer way of saying it. So the basis of legitimacy, as long as the economy continues to perform, there's not going to be significant challenges to the state. So again, not enough time to fully explore this, but I do think it's an important point to reiterate. And it's one of the reasons why when we think about Trump's targeting the economy, it was so problematic for the Chinese, and from their view warranted their own hard-hitting response. Now, the last point on here is to look at sort of nationalist US policies, the "to make America great again" rhetoric. And really, these are a shift from the past for the US, signaling a retreat from globalization. And were followed up really with US withdrawals from the global community in a lot of different ways. And this actually helped China make headways at a time when it was pursuing more outward economic expansion through things like the Belt and Road Initiative. So when the US was in retreat, China managed to work quickly to try and fill that vacuum. So in response, this raises, fear and suspicion in the US about China trying to become a global hegemon and expand its influence. Although much of what I want to point out today is that we see a lot of these roots that establish some of these concerns about the rise of the dragon, the rise of China, and fears that we are basically in a zero-sum kind of game, which means there can only be one winner. So China's gains are automatically considered US losses. But we shouldn't just look at these snapshots of the present without looking at the history that got us to this point. And so that's where I'd like to go next. So on the margins of the main economic factors that impact the Sino-US relationship are the following: Taiwan, the South China Sea, and Hong Kong. Now, we can look at the relationship that the United States has with Taiwan and the recent approval for arms sales to Taiwan and China's response, but that gets us into military and security components. The same could also be said, actually, of the South China Sea and China's increasing military presence and the building of islands in the region. And so while some of these, again, are in areas that are contested, it gets us into other issues that impact the relationship that China has with the US. And I'll save that for question and answers. Moreover, we could spend time looking at the democracy movements in Hong Kong and the response to the national security law that was implemented in June. And this gets us into questions about human rights. So in that same vein, we might look at Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, another important part of the current narrative on Sino-US relations. But the point now is that these issues continually impact the Sino-US relationship, and they're not really new. They do continue to present challenges to the relationship moving forward, but security, military threats, and human rights are not necessarily the prime focus today. Again, I'm happy to address it more in question and answers. It's part of understanding the US-China relationship, but it's on the margins of, I think, what the focus should be today. Now, with regard to the COVID era developments, I think it's kind of funny because we talk about the pre, during, and post-COVID era, and really what I'm talking about is 2020, right? So pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID is just more a year in recap. So it seems like a long time ago to think about some of these things, but we are just looking at the past year. So to make this simple, the key issues at stake this past year are the following. And again, if we think about some of the domestic challenges that China has had, not just China, but the US, it's the lockdown and the economic slowdown. So both of these have impacted, again, the US and China, forced to lock down their domestic populations, and the impact, of course, being that economic slowdown. The second thing to look at is really how the Sino-US relations have been impacted during this time. So increased tensions over calling it the China virus. And really, we've seen a series of diplomatic battles that have ensued. So we know the US forced the closure of the Houston consulate. The Chinese responded with the closure of the US's Chengdu consulate. And even last week, we saw new visa rules that were being implemented by the US on Chinese Communist Party members, trying to limit their stays to 30 days and limiting multiple visa entries. So we should expect the same coming from China shortly as well. So we see a lot of this, what we call tit for tat diplomacy. Whatever you do to me, I do back to you. And this relationship then between the US and China is further strained as domestic economic tensions are high. So when we think about it, it's kind of like Econ 101. When you start getting hit in the pocketbook, we start to look to assign blame, and it really becomes this fight for survival. So we divert attention away to foreign scapegoats, we'll reiterate nationalist sentiments while we focus on how to recover. And that's true for both actors, right? Both the United States and for China. Now I'm going to kind of go through this really quickly since we don't have a lot of time, but if you want to look at how China has rebounded out of COVID, one of the interesting parts to look at is the lack of politics attached to the masking issue. So of course we know that the Chinese have had mask usage prior to this point in time due to environmental issues. And so the politics of masking was never an issue like it was in the US. Moreover, those lockdown requirements were implemented throughout the country and not subject to local political debates, which has also helped quicken the recovery. So we can compare this to the US, where we're still having some of these debates, 10 months later. It's also clear that the politics in an authoritarian state allow for a faster recovery. And this is not to argue for authoritarianism. It really is just to point out that the policies and plans that can be implemented more quickly in an authoritarian state because it can be done so unilaterally. So this means that speed of recovery will be quicker than we see elsewhere, which is, again, remarkable given the size of China. So China quickly sealed its borders, doubled down to basically eradicate the virus, put Wuhan on lockdown, a city of 11 million people, for nearly 76 days, which some might argue is a little inhumane, but it worked. So finally, this gets us to the economics of a state-controlled system, which has also allowed for a faster recovery. And we can see that through the rapid injection of capital. The state-owned banks can loan money quickly and readily, even to sometimes failing entities, to keep that economy afloat. And remember my earlier point, the economy is the basis for legitimacy. So there's even more at stake for China to keep its economic engine roaring full steam ahead. Now compare this to the US. When we look at China, things are almost back to normal. And here we're kind of uncertain if we're moving forward towards normalcy or if we're on the verge of rolling backwards. And again, this is not to argue or advocate for the Chinese way. It's just to articulate the difference and see how China has rebounded out of COVID. So where are we now? China's making a quick recovery. The government can intervene at the slightest sign of problems and offset any major problems from emerging. That's one of the benefits of the Chinese state. And here we can see growth in Q3 compared to last year, right, is already 4.9% higher. And we can see consumer spending is recovering in China. People are flocking to malls. Things seem to be going back to normal. And China does have a historically high savings rate, around 40%. And this is all helping China, again, regain ground after the crisis, or in the middle of the pandemic, really still. So China's overall growth is almost at 6% again, which is where it was pre-pandemic. It's worth noting that the projected growth rates in China were expected to be just lower than 6% before the pandemic started. So this kind of recovery is actually quite remarkable. China's now reviving its economy at a time when most others are struggling. And this is all going to place it in a strategically important position as we move forward. So it kind of gives us a sense of what China has done to try to jumpstart its recovery and what China's economic health looks like and moving into what we might consider to be the post-COVID era. So what I wanted to do is look at some of the pillars of China's growth strategy to help us understand how we got to the present and where things are going into the future. So I've listed here a number of different initiatives which you may or may not be familiar with. RCEP, the BRI, Made in China, the Digital Health Silk Roads. These are all different Chinese plans that we're kind of focusing on now, but as you can see, they were put in motion years earlier. So I put in the parentheses different dates to kind of give you a sense of when they started moving. Even though we focus them on the contemporary period, we're thinking, they just happened or they're just starting now. So RCEP was drafted in 2011, but actually was only signed last month. So this is that Chinese counter to that US-led Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, that we know now is basically dead. The Belt and Road is China's plan to connect 70 countries in Asia, Africa, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, with 60% of the world's population and 35% of the global economy in an overland economic belt and a maritime Silk Road. So China's investing in and helping to build infrastructure in many different countries desperately in need of development that have largely been ignored. So that scheduled completion for the Belt and Road Initiative is 2049. And if you know your Chinese history, that'll be the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. That price tag attached to it is more than $1 trillion, and estimates are nearly 300 billion so far that have been spent to date. So it's worth noting there's already a great deal of controversy also surrounding many of those investments, but it gives you a sense of, again, one of those pillars of China's economic growth. The Digital Silk Road and the Health Silk Road are kind of subcomponents to the BRI. Now, the Digital Silk Road is about the expansion of 5G and data centers, and we can see some clear linkages to the Made in China 2025. That's just a few bullet points down. The Health Silk Road is what we're hearing about a little bit more now, but I want to point out it did start prior to COVID, where China would be able to provide medical aid and consultation to states. And this is, of course, helped by the fact that China is a major producer of medical equipment, masks, so on and so forth, which are all essential now. That Digital and Health Silk Road are simply extensions of the BRI, but again, they're two important pillars that we see that the Chinese economy is focusing to move forward post-COVID. Of course, there's also the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and that is a multilateral investment bank focusing on assisting development in Asia with 103 members. Of course, notably missing are Japan and the United States, but this offers an alternative to what we call the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus includes organizations like the World Bank and IMF, who generally tend to be more dominated by US and Western interests. Made in China 2025, if you're not familiar with it, focuses on the manufacturing of domestic content of core materials to basically about 70% in China by 2025. And this is that catalyst for China to become a technological powerhouse. Obviously, that has ties to the Digital Silk Road as well. And finally on here, I'd like to note that the infrastructure projects at home, these began really after the global recession, but they're also an important part of jumpstarting the Chinese economy in that post-COVID recovery as well. So looking at domestic investment. These pillars then are all part of China's plan for economic growth, both pre and post-COVID, and they have global implications that raise a number of concerns for the US specifically, as China's role and importance increases globally. So underlying China's recovery out of COVID is actually this dual circulation strategy. So this is where China will focus on domestic demand and innovation to drive the economy, right? That's that internal circulation. And then also maintain foreign markets and investors as a sign of engine growth. That's the external circulation. So that dual circulation economic strategy was unveiled by President Xi in May of this year as part of what will be part of that 2021 to 2025 five-year plan that the Chinese have. And really, it's the same plan that they've been trying for years to do, which is to spark domestic consumer spending. It just hasn't really worked yet. So this plan, now reinvented, is driven part by COVID and part by the trade war. So it's a defensive approach, you can argue, by Beijing to prepare basically for these worst case scenarios as the world undergoes geopolitical and economic changes. And China wants to reduce its vulnerability and threats to its manufacturing industry. So that's why it needs this dual approach. With the trade war, we saw that China's desire to increase domestic demand at a time when US demand for Chinese goods was being negatively impacted, then coupled with the current COVID crisis, right, which would impact that global supply chain. So supply chain disruptions during COVID shutdowns has not only impacted, completed manufactured products, but it also has given a lot of different states a second look at their overdependence or over-reliance on countries like China for these critical supplies of things like medical supplies and other components. So all of this has the potential to, again, negatively impact the Chinese economy and threatens China's manufacturing industry. So we see a Chinese push for domestic demand, and this is where many of China's pillars that have already been set into motion can help China, not just domestically, but globally, with an emphasis on enhancing technical connectivity and a number of those other items that were discussed previously. So this brings us to the part that you're most interested in, which is looking forward to speculate on what are China's challenges as well as where opportunities exist. And what I want to do is focus us on the economic components to give us a chance to then discuss what it means for that Sino-US relationship. So China faces a number of social, political, and economic challenges. And this is just a brief list, right? By no means exhaustive, of some of the areas that pose risks to China's continued economic development. So as you can see here, there are a number of different things. So rising labor costs in China and the aging population, both of these have demographic kinds of consequences to them as well as economic consequences. But there are areas of concern for China to be able to sustain that economic growth. Remember, economic growth is the key to understanding the sustainability of the Chinese system. The next item on here, the building a sizable Chinese middle class to fuel domestic consumer demand. As noted, this is an area where China has to focus on, which is the building of a middle class, because that is going to be the catalyst for its continued economic growth. And this is something they've been looking at for a number of years, but still have not managed to successfully be able to do. Mega projects and growing debt concerns are two other areas. And by going through these relatively quickly, what I'm assuming is that some of you will have more questions on things you want to hear more about as we get to the question and answer session. But the mega projects, China builds the largest of everything, right? The largest dams, the largest roads, the largest or the longest bridges. So these mega projects have been sort of the focal point for looking at China's growth development and have gained a lot of attention. But there are also a number of concerns, political concerns, as well as growing debt concerns that could pose significant challenges to the Chinese moving forward. These mega projects can't be sustained. And of course, with growing debt concerns, there's worries about the long-term viability of the Chinese economy. The subsidized state-owned sector is something that we hear often about, being concerned about how heavily involved the state is in various aspects of the economy, particularly with state-owned enterprises in key areas. Of course, we've been hearing about currency manipulation for decades, right? How the Chinese have managed to manipulate their currency, in particular looking at now, right, how the Chinese yuan seems to be relatively weak relative to other economies who we know are struggling more than the Chinese. So currency manipulation tends to be a recurring challenge or problem that the Chinese have to deal with, particularly over issues that it is creating or presenting for them an unfair trade advantage. And of course, these last issues, right? Western concerns over intellectual property theft, artificial intelligence, and of course, facial recognition use. And those issues are not just economic, but also tie into concerns about human rights, tie into concerns about what the Chinese may do with some of this technology. And again, not just domestically, but also those potential uses abroad. And being able to provide for some of this more advanced technology to other states, particularly authoritarian regimes, who may use that on their own domestic populations. The global focus on Xinjiang, the South China Sea, and Taiwan, of course, because there is an increasing global attention to some of these issues, this has the potential to negatively impact the Chinese economy. Some of this may result from conflict in those areas, which could disrupt supply chains. It could also be related to concerns over human rights issues, which could lead to sanctions by various states. So there's a lot of these other issues, really what China considers to be part of its core interests, which can be also problematic or challenging as China moves forward. And of course, we can look at these external factors like the US restrictions on TikTok, Huawei, and trade in general, growing concerns from Belt and Road Initiative partners on China's investment strings, and then also looking at what we consider to be a PR recovery, right? So China needs a little PR work, public relations work, post-COVID. And so those things also present significant domestic challenges, and you can make the argument that they pose significant domestic economic challenges that the Chinese face. So as I mentioned, these challenges are important because they pose risk to China's continued economic development. And a failing Chinese economy is not in the interest of the US. It would be destabilizing to China, it would be destabilizing to the global economy, and it would be detrimental to US political and economic interests as well. So what are China's global opportunities right now? So let's look at the return of the dragon. So first, the negative attention is received as the place of origin of the coronavirus is being countered by its assistance in producing and providing medical supplies and relief packages to many different countries, largely because it's been able to get its economy back on track a little bit quicker than others. So it's not just the health, but we also have to think about the impact as a producer of technology. So computers and tablets and cameras and phones, right? This is also providing essential needs for states as we've shifted life from being in person to online as we are now. Another important opportunity to mention is that China's also reshaping the global supply chains and institutions, particularly at a time when the US has been in retreat. Now, they have been quick to try to fill the void that the US has left behind and have done more to reach out to a number of states economically without military or political strings attached. Now, you can debate that, so there's ways to qualify or clarify it, but they haven't come in with the same kinds of strings that we normally see. So this has been beneficial to states that fall outside of those traditional Western interests, and it helps differentiate the Chinese from the US. In addition, it's not exactly like manufacturing can move elsewhere right now, given the travel concerns and the challenges that many other potential host states have faced. So China's the only option right now for global supply chains, right? We don't have the time and ability to get up and move them. So all of this can help China situate itself as a bridge to the developing world, and again, to position itself differently from the US. China's been there among the global poor and now has a seat at the table in a way that can position itself to help other states. It's one of the ways that China has, touted its position as a developing country, that it knows where other developing states have been and it can help them get to the place that it is now. So while the global economy is contracting, China is really the only one projected to grow this year, according to the IMF. And we know it's already slated to become the world's largest economy by somewhere between 2024 to 2032. Now that number keeps getting closer and closer. And so it gives you a real sense of, again, marking China's quick return to global significance post-COVID, right? This is truly that return of the dragon. So where does all of this leave Sino-US relations? We need to look ahead to what the future holds for the Biden administration and how they'll approach China, given that the current relationship is at arguably an all-time low. Now, this by no means is an exhaustive list, but it includes some of the key areas to focus on in the upcoming months. So let's first look at some of the challenges. So we can expect that Biden will actually be tougher on China with regard to human rights issues. With the current controversies surrounding forced labor and detention of Uyghurs in China, the concerns over democracy protests in Hong Kong, and we should expect that human rights will definitely take a front seat in the US rhetoric involving China in the coming months and years. And this will definitely have economic implications as well. As we've already seen with the recent bill banning the importing of certain Chinese products tied to forced labor in Xinjiang, right? The issues tied to human rights and the economy are things that we saw before China's entry into the World Trade Organization. So again, these are issues from the past that continue to come up, and we can expect that the Biden administration will be a little bit tougher on human rights issues than the previous administration just was. And that presents a challenge to the relationship. In addition, the concerns over technology involving intellectual property theft or spying in general, or the role of the Chinese state in the tech industry, China's expanding digital Silk Road. All of these things promise to be an ongoing challenge for the new administration. The Sino-US relationship has been soured in these areas, and it's going to take some time to repair. It actually arguably starts with the Chinese, who need to uphold their end of the phase one trade agreements on US agriculture purchases to help demonstrate to the US that they're a reliable partner. So it's not just the responsibility of the US, but the Chinese also need to make an effort in this area to help mend the relationship. So in addition to these challenges, and again, there are a number of different challenges we can look at. In terms of the opportunities, the US has a number of opportunities to return to global leadership, and one of those areas is in climate change. So by returning to the Paris Accord, they could start to re-engage with the Chinese, who have not only filled that leadership void, but have also been instrumental in the renewables field globally. So this would give the US some common ground with the Chinese, and it would be an olive branch that the US could extend to show their seriousness and commitment to global issues. Now, in terms of Taiwan, this is both an opportunity and a challenge. So it's an opportunity for the Biden administration to return the US to the status quo on the Taiwan issue, which really is a policy of strategic ambiguity, and to back off just a little bit on what China sees as a core interest. And I'm happy to talk more about core interests if there's interest in that particular aspect. So the US's role with regard to Taiwan is really not to mitigate that conflict. It really should be to just not actively contribute to it. So the Chinese see it as a China-Taiwan issue. The Taiwanese, of course, can't actively combat Chinese interests without the US involvement or without some assistance. But really, the United States should return to that sense of strategic ambiguity and maintain the status quo, and that can help mend the relationship on aspects related to Taiwan. And that's not to abandon Taiwan, but to get it back to a sense of normalcy, which is that nothing's happening necessarily as long as both sides are not provocative. So what the relation needs really, if we're looking at US-Sino relations overall, what the relation needs is to be more tempered, to have interactions that are more predictable and less personalized. And while we may never see ourselves in a cooperative relationship, we do need to move away from that zero-sum competition mindset and move towards coopetition. And that's the approach that both sides need to adopt to successfully move forward. I will stop there and allow for questions. Do you want me to end the show?
Sure. I mean, I think that answered just about everything. There was only a semester's worth of information in 25 minutes.
That's what I was going for.
Well, thank you. I'll start off here with a couple of questions. And as we've said, please put your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to those. So, one of the things, we all talk about, and I think it was mentioned in the chat, was the low wages, right? And so many US-based companies with facilities, because it's just so much cheaper from a wage standpoint. And anybody who knows a business, your personnel costs are one of your major costs. And it's mind-blowing to some people being able to ship product across the Pacific, manufacture it, assemble it, ship it back, and it'd still be cheaper than being here domestically. But as you said, those wages are starting to creep up. When, in your opinion, when does that become, that critical point where now it's not, cheaper anymore? Or, are we still pretty far off there, before that even becomes a conversation?
Well, this has been a conversation actually for some time already. So because there has been the move, particularly in light textiles, light industry, to places like Bangladesh or Vietnam, even in tech areas, right, moving to places like Vietnam where labor is cheaper. So this isn't something that's new necessarily, but the threshold will be difficult to determine, right? So when is it that's not going to be sustainable? I think it's one of the aspects that's important to think of how China is trying to engage in more high-end technology manufacturing as opposed to becoming reliant on foreign interests, to both increase the skill perhaps of the domestic labor force and also have a competitive advantage in another area that's going to be in high demand. What the Chinese will always have is a large population. So that's one of the benefits. They'll always have an ample labor force, but there's still going to be significant challenges in terms of understanding what that threshold is, particularly with a global economy. There's 7 billion people. China has 1.4 billion of them, but there are a lot of, more cost efficient places that labor could go. It could lead to an increase in the price of products though, as again, hardly any other state has the same kind of advantages that the Chinese do in terms of the infrastructure, the desire to bring in multinationals or foreign interests. The real concern has been whether or not more producers are going to want to bring products into China, particularly with IP issues. And that's one of the bigger areas of concern. So kind of a long-winded, convoluted answer.
No, that's great. Yeah, it kind of dovetails into my second question, talking about supply chain and reshoring. Early on in COVID with, a lot of the medical supplies, the PPE, the masks, all of that being made in China and overseas, and so much conversation around we need to reshore that. We can't be so reliant upon China. And you say, that they're very reliant on their economy from a governmental standpoint and mindset. I mean, does that scare them at all that, that we've exposed a, critical supply chain issue for the United States and we need to relook at that?
Obviously, and not only in that area, but really that's been coming. So part of, the rhetoric from the past administration has been trying to bring more things back home and not becoming so reliant on the Chinese. The medical industry is one area that not just the US has, of course, concern with, but, a lot of other countries are concerned about how reliant they are on China. And again, the COVID shutdowns in the initial stages, right, put a halt to a lot of things. And so everybody's fortunate to a certain extent that economic engine is back up and moving so that supply can be increased. As I mentioned, the challenge is you can't just get up and go ahead and start new manufacturing of various industries at home or in other more cost efficient places, right? Because it's not the time to do that. You can't easily go and scout out sites and set up new manufacturing and get everything and supply chains in place. So it's going to be a slow process. It's also part of the reason why China has looked at, sort of expanding what the original design is behind the Health Silk Road, which was really to kind of avoid the spread of a major, pandemic or epidemic, and then, try to help facilitate, connections to the health area. If you look at the aftermath, or I hate to say aftermath because we're not out of it, but looking at that kind of COVID recovery, China was quick to go ahead and offer supplies to countries like Italy, right? To again show that, look, they are part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that's been one area as well, part of that PR imaging after COVID, to not look at, hey, the virus originated here, but look, what are we trying to do to help alleviate some of this massive spread for the good of the global community? It's also another area, if you want to get back to US-China interests, where there's concern because while the US has retreated from certain areas, like with the World Health Organization, right, China is stepping up. And so that global vacuum poses a real threat or challenge to the US moving forward, because it's 7 billion eyes that are looking at, what is being done in the face of crisis. And the Chinese maybe were, part of that initial stage, of course, as in terms of where the virus originated, not maybe, but were. But then looking forward, what are they doing to help make solutions and inroads in that area? And that's helping them recover in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we got a bunch of questions that have fired in here in a short period of time. So let's see here. Andy Taft, does China agree that they need to cooperate, as you suggest? What's their side of it?
Well, I think that's a great question, because cooperation is difficult. So the difficult balance in the relationship is understanding, how both sides have to make some kind of concessions. And so if you look at the United States and China, there have been, we could go back in rhetoric and looking at how the US has called China a strategic competitor, how the US has argued that China needs to become a responsible stakeholder, right? These little phrases that are used to say, China, you need to step up. And from the Chinese perspective, and I'm selling it, but you don't have to buy it, right? So from the Chinese perspective, they have done a variety of things to the best of their abilities to try to fit into global schemes. Now, there are obviously some shortfalls, and that's why when we look at what needs to be done moving forward to make cooperation, it's never going to be cooperation, right? It is that sense of coopetition. So it's cooperation and competition, because you cannot eliminate that competition between two rival states. So the Chinese are aware, I would say, that there needs to be some give and take. The question is how much they feel like they're willing to give in certain areas. And that's where I want to reiterate, a key part is looking at the importance of the economy. Because without thinking about the basis of economic growth as a source of legitimacy, you might argue, well, every country cares about the economy, right? So we absolutely care if the economy is doing well. When it's not doing well, it impacts politicians, it impacts all of us. It can lead to a variety of different kinds of policies that may not be beneficial for the global economy. But for the Chinese, it's exceptionally important because, again, I cannot reiterate enough, right? You don't see that people are like, yes, the communist ideals fit, because the communist ideals do not embrace capitalism. And so as a result, there really is a sense economic growth, because things are going well, that can keep the current regime in power. But when things don't go well, that's when it can be destabilizing. And again, Hong Kong's a different story because it has a different system. It has a younger history as part of China. So those things are different in that context.
Okay. Okay. Can you speak to the expectations around congressional actions against U.S. listed Chinese securities?
So can I wait, repeat that? So can I speak to the, well, I don't have any insider information here. So can you please repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, congressional actions around U.S. listed Chinese securities, potential time frame for delisting. I mean, anything around that. I mean, back to the economy. I don't know. It's a question somebody asked.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm like fully capable of commenting more detail on those economic components.
Okay. What is the role of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in either bridging or aggravating current Sino-U.S. relations?
So the ASEAN states are quite interesting because the ASEAN states are part of RCEP. So when you're looking at that regional economic partnership that was just passed last month, the ASEAN states don't have a lot of bite, right? So these are the 10 Association of Southeast Asian Nation states that are not among, economic powerhouses or anything else. And one of the things to sort of be cautious about is China's relationship with its neighbors is one of, it's a careful relationship. So not a lot of states are just welcoming the Chinese with open arms, saying, yes, bring in, investment, or, we're going to follow along with what it is that you do. The ASEAN states don't have a security cooperation. They really are a way to basically formulate a unit that can be used to counter the power that China would have economically. But with RCEP, you have those 10 states as well as other countries that have now come together to try to formulate an Asian-directed economic growth plan. And that's, sort of one of the ways that we see the growing interest or power of the ASEAN states.
Okay. How does the U.S. and China manage the very differing but parallel challenges presented by our economic and military cooperation?
Yeah, well, there's no military cooperation between China and the U.S. So, thinking about, the managing the different challenges, really it's a matter of the different interests. So when you think about, strategies or possibilities forward, I think between China and the U.S., there are economic components where, again, it's sort of, we're tied together, right? We've been coupled with the Chinese. And so therefore their success is going to lead in some ways to our success as well, right? Their failures would be catastrophic. Their successes may not be the same for our successes, but it is important. The military dimension is another area of strategic rivalry, and where there's concern about China's growing influence in the South China Sea, there's concern about China's military modernization. And so that's a whole second component to the difficulty of the relationship and whether or not we can see cooperation. From a U.S. perspective, of course, we see, China has a base now in Djibouti, as the U.S. does. You have the Chinese building those artificial islands in the South China Sea, and some of those areas are contested, right? So all of this, if you're kind of an alarmist, you're thinking this is a sign of rising Chinese military power. And so that's going to lead to, and it's not to be underestimated, of course, but that's going to lead to certain kinds of actions, right? If you assume that this is an effort to project power and to gain a position militarily or to seek hegemony, then you're going to respond accordingly. I think that part of the challenge is that if you look at China historically, it hasn't necessarily, it claimed it's never going to seek hegemony. It hasn't done anything directly to try to project power outside of the region or to have a global military presence. But from a US perspective, we can't get out of that mentality of if China's rising, right? They may have not done it in the past, but we're not going to let it go by without paying attention now. So as they continue to rise, we have to be alert, pay attention, and do everything we can to try to stop that. And so these are two forces that fight against each other, where on the economic side of things, China's success could be relatively beneficial for many states. On the military side of things, you don't want to be left not paying close attention to it, but at the same time, you don't want to overreact so that China does more. And that's one of the areas, again, if you look at the trade war, some might argue that this pushed China, because now you're threatening our economic livelihood, right? Pushed China in certain ways. So it's that difficult balance of not pushing them to do things that are the opposite of what you would like as a final outcome. So that cooperation is so complex when you start putting the military component into it.
Right. There's nothing easy about that. So there's another question here. We might have already answered about it. It's asked in a different way, talking about the aging population and wages. So aging population, you mentioned that, but then, some of those dollars have been shifted to support that aging population, but then what's the plan? Is there a plan? What's the cost going to be as that aging population shifts out, fewer workers, increased costs, increased labor wages? So we hit it on that a little bit, but maybe from a different angle.
Yeah, so the aging population can be really problematic for a variety of reasons. So one, from the demographic standpoint, that aging population is a challenge because you basically have now what the Chinese call 4-2-1 problem. One kid supports 2 parents and 4 grandparents, right? So because of the one child policy in the past, right, this also presents itself as a challenge looking forward as the population has, better access to health and whatnot, live longer, that population ages, and you have fewer younger workers because of the one child policy to support that aging population. So that's one challenge that we see is sort of the economic burden that's placed on younger generations, not just for older people in general, but for their family members. Remember, a key difference between China and the US is that, when our parents get older in the US, you and I are looking for a Shady Oaks, a Shady Creek, they're going to some shady place, and, they're going to have a nice community to live in. In the Chinese context, mom and dad come to live with you, grandma and grandpa come to live with you. And so you are the long care assistants, right? You are that long-term living facility. And only in the last decade is when China started actually paying attention to having to think about elder care outside of what would be provided for in the family. So the aging population is problematic in a bunch of ways, right? Puts stress on the healthcare system. It puts stress on younger generations to be able to care for their parents. And then, of course, we have this shifting labor dynamic, particularly as you have early retirement ages in China as well. Like, you're not waiting until 75 or 80 to retire. You might be retiring at 55 or 60, right? Mandated retirement. So this is also creating new economic burdens on younger generations, even within just a family household, as opposed to just the state. So all of those shifts to the demographics as a result of the one-child policy, which has been alleviated to a 2-child policy, and thinking about the impacts on the labor force, present new kinds of challenges. And I would argue that these are the areas, when you look at all of the potential economic challenges that China faces, again, that list that I showed before is a small list. If any of these start to build up, this would be bad. It would be bad for the Chinese. It would be bad for a lot of countries. It would be bad for a lot of people. And so that difficult balance of keeping everything intact is becoming even more difficult because there are more holes, right? That old iron rice bowl, it used to have a crack. Now it's got a crack and holes in it. And it's difficult to keep it all together.
Okay. Well, I can tell you, my wife would really appreciate it if my parents came and lived with us in their retirement. I can just say that. I'm lying about that. Okay, here's a good one. What do you expect from the European community? Are they going to take a tougher stance on China and trade?
I don't know that the EU would take a tougher stance on China than with trade, largely because they have more interest to kind of navigate. You also have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is going to be helpful to the European economies as well. And so there's a lot of ways that connecting China and that overland route and then maritime route to these different parts is also beneficial to European states in ways that's not as directly beneficial to countries like the US. Right? Because you have those infrastructure. If you put in roads and railroads, that's going to assist the countries that can utilize those. It's not just benefiting China. And so it's not clear that they would necessarily take a harder line stance. They generally tend to be a little bit softer on China, I would say, than the US has.
Okay. This is an interesting one. Completely, it says fringe question, which is great. We kind of get off the economy and everything. So the strained relationship between US and China right now, is that going to have a negative impact on Chinese children adoption by Americans?
Well, that is an interesting question. So there has been problems and challenges in the past with this. So the Chinese rolled out a variety of different kinds of restrictions a number of years ago to slow down adoptions. And part of that is because they weren't trying to encourage. So if you are an expectant mother or whatever, and you know that your child you're going to give it up for adoption, or that it's a baby girl in some cases, and we can go into all the logistics behind that, then you can drop it off at an orphanage, and some wonderful set of parents on the Upper East Side of San Francisco, Dallas, Fort Worth, wherever, are going to adopt that child, then you don't think twice about it. So new restrictions were put in place to stop seeing that as like a nice viable option. So we think about possible restrictions or impacts on Chinese adoption. Those sort of things existed before. If I can take that sort of line of questioning on a tangent, the bigger concern, particularly today, is concern over what might be seen as either discrimination or targeting of Chinese Americans, given the coronavirus, given a variety of other things that have led to, challenges for Chinese Americans in the U.S. And so if you think about, we can't predict what's going to happen, when children, get older, obviously. But there's multiple factors that you can look at that are complex in terms of understanding the impacts that could be seen with adoption.
Okay. All right. We'll go back to the economics of this here for a second, because we had several questions on the tariffs. I know you touched on that too. So you had, Trump and the tariffs, and now you have Biden, and this is your crystal ball here, is Biden going to roll back those tariffs short term? What have been the impact on those tariffs, the exodus of some manufacturing companies into those, surrounding countries around China, like you had said, is that a real thing? Is that going to come back? What do you think that outlook is if Biden rolls that back, or if those stay in long term, either side of the equation? How does that impact both sides?
I don't know that it would necessarily be rolled back. And I think, strategically, it wouldn't be good to just go ahead and remove the tariffs. One of the things the Trump administration has done is played hardball with the Chinese in ways that nobody has before. And so with the Chinese at the negotiating table, and with phase one being implemented, as I said, the real challenge will be China needs to step up and actually adhere to the agreement that happened pre-COVID, right? So phase one was signed before COVID really kind of, unveiled itself. And so if the Chinese were, trying to show good faith, they would go ahead and uphold those. So the likelihood that Biden's going to roll those back, particularly just eliminate them, I would say is not particularly high. Although there may be ways, because there's also, of course, concern in the U.S. domestic population about what to do on China, and particularly the divisiveness that has existed and the polarization in the U.S. political context now, recently, in the coming months. And so, as far as looking at what U.S. policy should be or is likely to be moving forward, I would say that it seems more likely that modifications could be made to, again, show cooperation in some way. So the U.S. could make certain concessions on the Chinese, but to erase them, I think, would be not a good move, neither from the U.S. perspective. And I think it sends a wrong message to the Chinese that, that we're not serious about those things, because it did bring them to the table. Now, the impacts of the tariffs on the Chinese were not as big as the U.S. would have hoped. Right. Again, given how large the Chinese economy is, how non-reliant it is on U.S. products, nevertheless, there are reasons to be concerned about a large U.S. market putting in these restrictions. And this is one of the areas where, if you've been paying attention more recently, the U.S. restrictions on Xinjiang products, so things like cotton, what else is there? Polyfibers. These are all new policies designed to hit the Chinese on the issue of forced labor, which is probably where we're going to see more of what I would assume Biden would do is hit on the aspects of human rights issues and link that to aspects of trade. That's what we've done in the past. The U.S. has done that in the past with most favored nation status, on trying to hit the Chinese on human rights issues to get them to behave on areas of economic. And behave, I mean behave in the interest of the U.S. So I would say probably not likely, and not a good policy to remove those, the trade war kinds of tariffs, but work with the Chinese moving forward to get them back to a more manageable level. Obviously, we're trying to promote economic liberalization, right, on a global scale. So that involves trying to have freer trade, and probably more likely pressing the Chinese on things like currency manipulation, as opposed to just looking at the trade aspects.
Okay. So I'll go one more question here, yeah, and then we'll wrap it up. So we've always had our eye on China, right? And what are they doing over here, and the wages and the political climate, everything you've mentioned here today. Who does China have their eye on? Who do they see as kind of their way? We better watch out for those folks over there.
That's a great question. I think well, of course, they're going to be paying attention to the United States. But one of the things that I think is also important to think about with China is that China is not necessarily globally oriented in the sense of trying to be a massive power, a superpower that wants to achieve a sense of hegemony. What they are concerned about is their neighborhood. And their neighborhood has some challenges because of the contentious nature of North Korea, which brings the U.S. into their backyard and other states. So they're keeping an eye on what they can and cannot do to keep that from becoming a big issue. And really the issues of Taiwan and, again, what the Chinese call their core interests. And what core interests are, I made reference to it in the talk, but what core interests are these are interests that the Chinese will defend at whatever cost. And they consider them to be really domestic interests. So these are Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, right? You could argue Hong Kong. These are all part of what they consider to be the Chinese state, which means if these try to leave or secede in some capacity, they will do whatever it takes. So that's where their military buildup, you might argue, is focused, is on keeping Taiwan from declaring independence and keeping Hong Kong from trying to secede, or Tibet or Xinjiang, right? Keeping the Chinese state intact. So that's where that's where their eye is always looking. And again, seeing how they can keep everybody else out of their backyard. So I think that's more of the issue as opposed to who they want to try to compete with. They just want everybody else to leave them alone.
Okay. Well, this has been tremendous. This has been a ton of information. For the folks who are on here still, we're recording this. It'll be on our website, be on our social media. So certainly go back and watch it again and try to digest this. I'll probably have to watch it 10 times to digest all this information. So it's been tremendous. And if we didn't get to your question, I apologize. We're running out of time here, but we'll get those over to the good doctor and she'll answer those questions and we'll get them back to you. So again, thank you very much. I did get a text message from Sarah Thurber from our office, who's a tennis player. She wants to take you on. She thinks she can. So we'll get that lined up as well. Now, thank you very much. We appreciate the time you've taken with us today. And for those of you who are still here, thank you again. And we will talk to you soon. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.